We said last time that we've now got a clear idea of the national income accounts. And that's going to be useful to us now as we begin to look at how the government controls the economy. And in this lecture, we're going to focus particularly on the control of the economy in order to deal with problems of unemployment. Now, we said at the start of the last lecture that there are two different approaches that different economists have towards this problem. One is the classical view that we'll look at next time. But now we're going to look at what is called the Keynesian view of how the government should deal with the problem of unemployment. Keynes was writing during the 1930s at a time when there was a huge recession in the economy and unemployment was very high. And he began to popularize some ideas that economists before him had presented as a way of dealing with this problem. Now, since he was writing, other economists have developed these ideas and added to them, but the basic insights that Keynes was proposing still form the heart of Keynesianism. And it's the essence of Keynesianism that we're going to have a look at now in this lecture. So last time, when we looked at national income accounts, any economist would say, yes, that's how the income accounts are constructed. This time we begin to look at some things which are controversial, and we'll see next time that the classical economists don't agree with everything that I'm now putting to you. But here is the kind of Keynesian view of the world. And the starting point of understanding the Keynesian view of the world is the national income accounts. We're looking at how the level of output and ultimately the level of unemployment gets determined in an economy. And we're going to do it diagrammatically. So let's turn now to the first diagram to see how we begin to develop a Keynesian view of the problem of unemployment. On this diagram I've got in front of you, we're measuring along here the national income or the national output. Remember from our identities last time, national income, national output are the same thing. Up here, we're plotting national expenditure. And we agreed when we looked at the national income accounts that income and output must be identically equal to expenditure. And we can show that by drawing a 45-degree line from the origin. How does that show that? It says for any level of national output, for example, if the level of national output in an economy is 550 billions, if that's the level of output, it must be the same as the level of income. We saw that. Well, somebody bought this output. So national expenditure must also be 550. If national income is only 200 billions, then national expenditure is only 200 billions. The 45-degree line simply shows us the national income identity that what is output and income must also be equal to expenditure. But now, says Keynes, there's a distinction to be made between the actual amount of expenditure and planned expenditure. People may plan to purchase output, but not succeed in doing so. So having looked at the relationship between actual income and actual expenditure, we're now going to look at the relationship between incomes and what people plan to spend. Now, who are the people that are planning to buy output? We saw that when we looked at the national expenditure table. Consumers' demand, C. Firms' investment demands, I. Government plans to buy output, G. Plans of foreigners to buy our output, X, export, less the extent to which we buy output from overseas, imports. So we have all these elements to think about when we will look at the relationship between national income and our plans to buy output. What's the relationship, says Keynes, between the amount of income we have as a society and the extent to which we plan to buy output? Let's take our first group, consumers. What's the relationship between income and what consumers plan to buy? Well, says Keynes, the basic relationship would look something like that. What does that say? It says, as people's incomes rise, they plan to buy more goods and services. Nothing surprising about that. We might want to write C(p) to emphasize that this is planned consumption, what consumers plan to buy at different levels of income. You might notice that at zero income, I've assumed that people still plan to buy something. This is known as autonomous expenditure, that people will still wish to buy even at zero income. They can do this by running down their assets or by borrowing. They're not going to die because they don't earn any income. They're going to find some way of spending even when they don't have any income. But as income increases, planned consumption rises. But there's not only the relationship between income and consumers' plans to buy. The next group is investment demand. So what happens to investment demand, investment expenditure, as income rises? Well, there's a case for saying that as income rises, investment demand rises as well. But we'll make a simplifying assumption and assume that investment is always the same, planned investment is always the same, regardless of the level of income. Planned investment demand is independent of the level of income, is, as we say, entirely autonomous. What about government spending, government's plans to buy teacher services and so on? Well, I'm going to keep the economy that I've got here as simple as possible, and I'm going to assume that also government spending is autonomous, whatever the level of income. Planned government spending looks like that. So we've got consumption demand, investment demand, government demand. What's the next one? Remember our national income accounts? Planned exports. What's the relationship between income and plans to purchase exports? Well, as our income changes, it doesn't cause a change in the extent to which foreigners want to buy our goods and services. It may cause a change in their demands for our exports if their income changes, but not if our income changes. So exports are also autonomous, independent of the level of our income, planned export demand. And finally, import demand. As our incomes rise, what happens to our plans to buy goods and services? And the answer is, it will tend to rise. As we get better off and our incomes rise, planned import demand will increase. We'll want to buy more French perfume, Italian wine, and so on. So we've now got these individual components of planned demand and how they change as income changes. What we'll now do is sum these together to give us planned aggregate demand. So what we're doing now is adding together plans to consume, C, plus I, plus plan G, plus plan X, minus plan M. Remember that the extent to which we buy imports reduces our demand for currently produced goods and services in our own economy. So if we sum C plus I plus G plus X minus M, we'll have the relationship between national income and planned total expenditure, planned aggregate demand. Let's see what that looks like in terms of the diagram. Here's the actual expenditure as against actual income that we had earlier. Now I'm going to plot the planned aggregate expenditure. And it looks something like this. Some elements are autonomous, but some are induced by rises in income, So if I sum C plus I plus G plus X minus M, I get something like this, which is planned aggregate demand. So this is what consumers plan and other groups plan to buy, but we know from our national income accounts that the 45-degree line shows us what is actually the case. Now, what's going to happen in an economy at some given level of income? Let's go back to the diagram and see how people plan to behave, and then think about what actually happens if their plans are not consistent with what we would expect. We can see that if we go back to the diagram. Here we are, and I'm going to suppose, first of all, that the level of national income, for some reason, is back here at 450 billion euros, pounds, whatever it happens to be. If the amount that we're producing in the economy is 450, then somebody is receiving 450's worth of income. Income equals product. They plan to buy more than is actually being produced. At 450, we'll say plans to buy output are 480. So here's an economy in which national income is 450, and this causes people to wish to buy 480's worth of national output, but only 450 is being produced. So to that extent, we have a gap between what people wish to buy and the amount of output which is being produced. In my case, it's a gap of 30 billions. What is that 30 billions? It's going to be met in some way. How is it going to be met? Firms are experiencing a demand for 480. They're only producing 450. What are they going to do? Answer, says Keynes, they're going to run their stocks down. They're going to meet this demand by reducing the amount of stocks. So this 30 billions is an unplanned stock decrease. How are they going to respond when they realize that the demand is greater than the amount they're producing? Well, says Keynes, they can't go on running down their stocks forever. At some point, they're going to say, we need to increase the amount of output to meet the extra demand. So as they produce more output, national output rises. Now let's suppose that we're in an economy where 550 billions or whatever is being produced. We can read off the planned aggregate demand curve that if national income is 550, the amount of demand is only 520. So demand is 520, but the amount of output being produced is 550. So firms find that they're producing more output than anyone wants to buy. And this gap, this 30 billion gap, is an unplanned stock increase. They're watching themselves producing output that they can't sell, and their stocks are rising because they're producing stuff more than people wish to buy. How are they going to behave if they're watching unplanned stock rises? They won't go on doing that forever. What will they do is cut down upon the amounts that they're producing. In other words, national product will fall. So you can see what's going to happen. The economy will only be in equilibrium when the plans to buy output are equal to the amount that's actually being produced, in my case, 500 billions. If national output is 500 billions, plans to buy this output is 500, and there are no unplanned stock changes. So it's important to see that in the Keynesian view of the world, two things are true. One is that there is only one level of national output at which the amount being produced is equal to plans to purchase it. And the second thing to see is that the economy will always tend to move towards this level of national output, because if there's a different level of output being produced, unplanned stock falls or unplanned stock rises will cause firms to change the equilibrium level of output and adjust the economy to that particular level. This is the level of output which is equilibrium in the economy. Now, this argument that we're developing, we'll see next time, is very controversial. But in Keynes's understanding, there is an equilibrium level of output, a level of output to which the economy will always drift if left to the market. But he says, there's no reason to suppose that this equilibrium level of output will be the level of output at which we have full employment in the economy. It is perfectly possible that at this level of output, there are still people who are unemployed, that there are people coming to the factory gates and saying, give us a job. And firms are responding by saying, no, go away, we don't need you. We're producing all the output that we need to produce in order to satisfy demand. We have unemployment equilibrium. The economy is in a state of rest. It's not going to change. And there's lots of unemployment out there. That, says Keynes, is what can happen in market economies. Left to itself, the equilibrium level of output is not necessarily going to be the full employment level of output. Therefore, the government has to be involved in manipulating the volume of demand. That's important to see that Keynes is not being critical of individual markets. If you look at the market for plumbers, if there's an excess supply of plumbers, the market price for plumbers will fall until the number of plumbers demanded by people is equal to the number of plumbers supplied. The market will work perfectly well. But what is true of individual labour markets is not true at the aggregate, at the total level. It is perfectly possible, says Keynes, for aggregate demand to be less than the amount of output that is required to bring about full employment. So here now we have justification for government intervention in running the economy. The government looks, sees this unemployment and says, we must do something. And what can they do? The answer is obvious. We need to stimulate demand in some way. We need to raise the volume of aggregate demand such that it's sufficient to cause firms to produce the level of output at which anybody who wants a job has got one. We deal with the unemployment problem by stimulating aggregate demand. How do we do that? Come back to the elements of aggregate demand that we have in the economy. Consumption demand. Let's raise consumption demand. Let's cut taxes and stimulate people to buy more. Or investment demand. There's not enough investment. Okay, let's subsidize firms to invest more. Or let's have government increasing its own expenditure and governments undertaking road building programs or buying new hospitals or whatever. You stimulate investment demand. You stimulate government demand. Hire more teachers, hire more nurses, raise government expenditure. It may be possible to stimulate export expenditure by subsidizing exports or by lowering the exchange rate and making it cheaper for foreigners to buy our goods and services, raising the export function. Or it may even be possible to reduce import expenditure and encourage people to switch from imports to domestically produced goods and services, perhaps by changing the exchange rate or imposing import taxes, so that by doing that, we switch to home demand, stimulating the demand for British output or whichever country we're talking about, and therefore raising the demand for employment and reducing the level of unemployment. So by doing that, we may, as a government, be able to manipulate the volume of planned demand to bring about the full employment level of output. Let's see how that works in terms of the diagram. Here we have an economy with a given volume of aggregate demand, aggregate planned demand, and the equilibrium level of output is here 500. Suppose we stimulate consumption demand or export demand or a series of others. What we'll have this is 450 at the moment. Suppose we think that the level of output which would give us full employment would be as much as, say, 500. How can we bring about an equilibrium at 500? We raise the aggregate demand function in that way to planned aggregate demand here somewhere, AD dash or whatever, and by raising aggregate demand, it means that at 450 we now have this unplanned stock change. This stimulus of demand is causing firms to find that their stocks are now declining, and they respond by raising the level of output so that the new equilibrium level of output is not at 450 but is at 500. So if we know roughly what is the level of output which corresponds to the full employment level of output, we can stimulate the economy appropriately to raise the equilibrium level of output. So the government then can manipulate the volume of aggregate demand, raising it during a period of unemployment. And if it comes to the point where the economy is having over full employment, even at the full employment level, there is still further demand on the economy, well, then they can reduce aggregate demand in some appropriate way by increasing taxes or whatever. The idea is for governments to be involved in manipulating the volume of demand to ensure that the economy has an equilibrium level of output which equals the full employment level. Now, you might reasonably think that if they do that, it's a fairly straightforward calculation. If the economy is at 450 and the equilibrium level of national output, which has full employment, is 500, we need 50 billion pounds worth of output more than we've got at the moment. Well, then the government simply stimulates aggregate demand, perhaps by increasing government expenditure, by 50, and output will rise accordingly. Actually, if they did that, they'd get it badly wrong. And they'd get it badly wrong because when governments stimulate aggregate demand, there is what is called a multiplier effect. How does the multiplier effect work? Let's suppose that governments stimulate the economy by increasing government expenditure by, let's say, 20. So there's an extra 20 billion pounds worth of demand. How do firms respond? They increase output by 20 billions. there is a government programme to build more hospitals, £20 billion worth of extra expenditure. Firms respond by increasing output, and we have £20 billion worth of hospitals more than we had before. But wait, if that's the case, somebody out there has just earned an extra £20 billion. Wages, profits, and so on. If output rises by 20, incomes rise by 20. But if incomes rise by 20, what are they going to do? With that 20, at least some of it, they're going to spend. Some of that extra 20 will be taxed away by the government. Some of it, they'll choose to save. Some of it, they'll choose to spend on imports. But some of it, they'll say, now incomes are higher, we can afford to buy more. So there's a further rise in the demand upon firms, a second round, if you like, of demand, coming from the fact that when the government stimulated demand, output rose, incomes rose, and consumers now begin to spend. So firms respond by increasing output further. But if they increase output further, somebody's incomes rise. And if somebody's incomes rise, they'll take some of it and get it taxed away. They'll take some of it and save. They'll spend some on imports, but some proportion of it they'll spend. And there will be a further increase, a further round of spending. And so the total amount at the end of this process, the total amount of extra output is not the original increase in government extra spending, it's some multiple of that. There is a multiplier effect. Let's look at the diagram. We wanted to raise national output from 450 to 500. There is the extra output that we produced. Did we need to raise expenditure by that much? We did not. We only needed to raise it by that much. And when we raised planned demand by an extra 20 billion, the extra output we got was not 20, but through this multiplier effect was more than that. It went from 450 to 500. Now this particular economy then, we've got that for every 1 billion increase in that the government stimulates output, we actually get a rise in output of some multiple of that 2.5 times. How can we begin to work out the extent to which output rises for a given increase in expenditure planned in autonomous expenditure induced by the government? What's the relationship between increased demand brought about by the government and the extent to which output begins to rise? That's the multiplier effect. How do we decide on the size of this multiplier? Is the multiple going to be 2 or 3 or 4? What determines the extent to which there is a rise in aggregate demand, in aggregate output, when aggregate demand is stimulated? I hope you can see, we'll do it formally in just a moment, but I hope you can see that in principle, what determines it is the extent to which, as our incomes rise, we choose to spend more, and the extent to which we don't spend more because we save it, or because we have it taxed away, or because we spend it on imports. If, when we receive an extra euro, the government takes 50 cents, and we choose to save 40 cents, and we choose to import an extra 5 cents worth, there's virtually nothing left for that second round of stimulus in the economy, because the extra bit of consumption demand, the marginal amount of extra consumption, is very small. But if when we receive an extra pound's worth of income, we spend a great deal of it on extra output, the multiplier is going to be much larger. So what determines the size of the multiplier is the extent to which we spend the extra income on domestically produced goods and services. That's the key. Now let's see how that works in terms of a simple bit of algebra, and we can do it in a fairly straightforward way, and it will look something like this. If we start off with a very simple economy, and we'll assume, in order to keep this as simple as possible, that there is no taxation in the economy, and we don't even have any imports or exports, sometimes referred to as a closed economy. So what we have is an economy in which the amount of consumption demand is just some portion of income. I'll write C equals CY, that is to say the amount of consumption demand is, it might be half or 3/4 or whatever it is of the amount of income we've earned, and we're going to save the rest. Now, in equilibrium, the amount of output we produce is going to be the amount of demands made upon it. So consumption demand plus investment demand. Remember, there's no government and there's no international trade. So the amount of output which firms wish to produce is going to be enough to satisfy demands from consumers plus the demands from firms for investment purposes. But you notice that consumption is always some proportion of income. So in equilibrium, the equilibrium level of output Y is equal to, I'm going to replace C with this term, little cy plus I. So this is the level of output which will satisfy demands made upon it. I can rewrite that by saying Y1 minus C is equal to I. And I can rearrange that further to say that Y over I is equal to 1 over 1 minus C. And if that's true for levels of national output, that the amount of Y over the amount of investment demand is equal to this term 1 over 1 minus C, if that's true for the level, it's true for changes. The change in Y over the change in I equals 1 over 1 minus C, where this term C is the proportion of any extra income we earn that we choose to spend. That is to say, what Keynes referred to as the marginal propensity to consume. So let's take a little simple example with a few numbers now and see what that would mean. Suppose we wish to raise the level of income by 50, then we can say that the change in Y needs to be 50 over the change in I, the extent to which we're going to stimulate the economy, perhaps through investment demand, will have to equal 1 over 1 minus. Now let's make an assumption that the proportion of any additional income that we choose to spend is a half. Then we can rewrite that 50 over the change in I equals 1 over 1 minus a half is 2. This is the multiplier, and the multiplier is determined by this term little c, the extent to which we spend any additional income on domestically produced goods and services. So if we had an economy where this is true, and we wish to raise national income to the full employment level by 50, and if we know that the multiplier is 2, then we know that the change in I will have to be, in our case, 25. We know the extent to which we have to stimulate aggregate demand in order to raise the level of national income by the appropriate amount to eliminate unemployment. So let's try to summarize where we've got to. According to the Keynesian view of the world, there is going to be a period of time in which we're going to have unemployment in the economy. When there's unemployment, it's because there's a shortfall in aggregate demand. The government can deal with that by stimulating aggregate demand. To what extent do they stimulate aggregate demand? It depends upon the size of the multiplier. If the multiplier is 2, every time we stimulate demand by 1 billion, output will rise by some multiple of that. We can use the idea of the multiplier to determine the extent to which the government needs to stimulate aggregate demand. Now, in an economy in which the only element that we have to think about is consumption demand, and we've just worked out the multiplier in terms of an economy with no government and no international trade, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus C, where C is the proportion of additional income that consumers wish to spend. Now, we just want to take that one step further before we stop and make this multiplier slightly more realistic. So we'll just do that now in this way. In my economy, the only element that we had was household expenditure and investment. But actually, some bits of expenditure leak out of the circular flow of income in the form of taxation, and some in the form of imports. So let's say for every 1 extra euro you receive, what happens to it? Let's suppose that 20% of it is taxed away by the government. T is equal to 20%. So I've introduced a government into the economy now to make it a bit more realistic. And we'll have some international trade, and for every extra pound, extra euro that you earn, you spend 10% of it on imports. And what about saving? Well, if your marginal propensity to consume out of a euro earned, you spend, say, 80% of it, then you choose to save 20%. So let's suppose that the marginal propensity to save for extra euro earned, you choose to save 20% of it. We've got this. So for every euro you receive, half of it leaks out of the circular flow of income, and you spend the other half. What's the size of the multiplier in this open economy with a government? Well, we simply write it like this. It's 1 over, originally I said 1 minus C. We could have replaced that by S. Since anything we don't consume, we save. So it's 1 over S, but now we've got to add the extent to which we have our incomes taxed by the government and the extent to which we choose to spend it on imports, M. So our multiplier in this kind of economy is still 1 over what we might call the marginal propensity to withdraw, the extent to which the extra euro leaks out of the circular flow, but now we've got an S, a T and an M. That gives us 1 over, in my case, 20.2 plus 0.2 for the taxes plus 0.1 for the imports. That is to say, 1 over a half equals 2. The multiplier in this open economy is 2. So to bring this lecture to an end then, we've established now in the Keynesian view of the world, there's an equilibrium level of output. It may not be the full employment level of output. The government can change the equilibrium level of output by stimulating aggregate demand appropriately. They do it by knowing some idea of the multiplier, the extent to which this extra income will be spent or not, and so they can stimulate the economy by the appropriate amount to bring about full employment. Now, the Keynesians recognize that this is not as easy as I've tended to imply. It's going to be quite difficult to know what this marginal propensity to consume is. It might change over time. The government might get it wrong. There's a further problem that the timing is going to be so difficult. They look at the economy with unemployment and they think, now is the time to stimulate the economy by the appropriate amount. Let's get some new hospital built. By the time they've made the decision, by the time they've decided where to build the hospital, by the time they've decided who's going to build it, by the time the builders have turned up to build the hospital, it's another 18 months to 2 years. Maybe by now, the economy's coming out of recession and we don't need this extra expenditure. The timing of this extra expenditure is going to be very difficult. But in the Keynesian view of the world, despite all the problems of knowing how to control the economy, it's better than doing nothing. If we sit around waiting for the market to do something about it, it may take years. The government has to get its hands dirty, get in there and stimulate the economy, control the economy, because it can't be left to the market. So now we're moving towards the heart of a Keynesian view of the world. Next time, we'll develop that Keynesian view, and we'll also begin to look at why the classical economists disagree about some of the things that we've said so far.